Howdy! In this mini lecture, we will examine habitats and niches, characteristics of populations, and various components of population ecology, including logistic and exponential growth curves, carrying capacity, and R versus K selected species. The student learning objectives of this mini lecture are: outline the characteristics of populations that help predict population growth, describe and distinguish between logistic and exponential growth, describe and distinguish between specialists and generalists, describe and distinguish between R strategists and K strategists, explain carrying capacity, limiting factors, habitat, and niches. There's often some confusion as to the difference between habitat and niche. A habitat is the environment where an organism lives. A habitat consists of living and non-living elements around the organism. Habitats can include, but are not limited to, rock, soil, weather patterns, and plant life. A niche, however, reflects how species uses resources and functions in a community. Niche can include how an organism uses its habitat, how the organism fits into the flow of energy and matter in the habitat in which it lives, and how the species interacts with other species in its community. A famous ecologist once described the difference between habitat and niche by saying, "Habitat is the organism's address, and niche is its profession." Organisms vary in how broadly they occupy their habitat or their role in their niche. Specialists are species that have narrow niches and very specific needs. They are highly adapted for their habitat and thus extremely good at what they do. However, because they are so well adapted for such a specific environment, they are very vulnerable to changes to their habitat. A koala bear is a great example of specialists. Generalists are species with very broad niches. They can use a wide array of habitats and resources and survive and thrive in a variety of environments. Raccoons are a perfect example of a generalist. Try on your own to think of some more examples of specialists and generalists. To fully understand population ecology, we need to consider some characteristics all populations exhibit that affect their future dynamics. To begin, recall from your reading that a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same location at the same time. Population size is simply the number of individuals at a given time. Population size can increase, decrease, cycle, or remain constant. The picture here shows a passenger pigeon, which was pushed into extinction in the early 1900s by deforestation and hunting. Population density is a measure of the number of individuals in a population per unit area. Large organisms usually have low densities because they generally need more resources in a large area to survive. There are pros and cons to low and high population density. A pro to having a high population density is that it is easier to find a mate. Cons to high population density are that there is increased competition, increased vulnerability to predation, and increased transmission of diseases. A pro to having low population density is that individuals enjoy more spaces and resources. However, it's harder to find a mate. Populations generally fall into one of three types of population spatial distribution patterns. Random distribution is when individuals are haphazardly located in the habitat with no pattern to their distribution. This pattern is seen when resources are plentiful in the habitat and other organisms don't strongly influence where an individual settles in the area. Uniform distribution is when individuals are evenly spaced throughout the habitat. This distribution pattern is seen when individuals are territorial or when there's competition for resources. Finally, clump distribution is when populations aggregate around resources, such as water, food, shelter, safety, or mates. This pattern is most common in nature. The sex ratio of a population is the proportion of males to females. This proportion can influence whether a population grows or shrinks over time. Sex ratios vary from species to species. Age structure or age distribution is the relative number of organisms of each age in a population. For humans, age structure is often displayed in an age structure diagram, as is seen here. We will talk more about these types of figures when we discuss human population. To review, the characteristics which influence the dynamics of a population over time are population size, density, distribution, sex ratio, and age structure. Now we'll examine population growth. Very simply, growth rate is the rate of change in a population size per unit time. The events that cause a population to grow are birth and immigration, and the events that cause a population to decrease are death and immigration. Please note that immigration spelled with an I means individuals coming into a population, and immigration spelled with an E means individuals leaving a population. Growth rate is expressed as a percent of net change per 1,000 individuals per year, so that different populations can be compared. Using a percent allows population ecologists to project changes that will occur in a population over the long term. For example, a population with 0.6% growth would be expected to grow from 1000 to 1006 in 1 year. There are two types of population growth patterns we will examine: exponential and logistic. Exponential growth is when a population increases by a fixed percent. When graphed over time, this will display a J-shaped curve. Exponential growth occurs in nature when populations are small, competition is low, and conditions are ideal. Exponential growth cannot continue indefinitely because at some point, a constraint, usually availability of resources, will be encountered. Introduced species, which are species not native to an area brought in accidentally or intentionally, often exhibit this type of growth. To think of exponential growth in a different way, think of the money in your savings account. As principal accrues interest, the sum grows each year. Your interest rate is a fixed percent. A fixed percent of a small number makes a small difference, but a fixed percent of a large number produces a large increase. As savings accounts, or populations, become larger, each incremental increase likewise becomes larger. A population will continue to grow exponentially until it reaches the carrying capacity, or the maximum population size the environment can sustain. The carrying capacity is determined by limiting factors, such as water, space, food, and disease. All the limiting factors together account for what is called environmental resistance. Environmental resistance stabilizes the population at its carrying capacity. Limiting factors slow and stop exponential growth, causing what is called logistic growth. Logistic growth, when graphed, looks like an S-shaped curve. The carrying capacity of a habitat may not be the same forever. Because the environment is complex and changes continually, carrying capacity can increase and decrease. For example, after a forest fire, carrying capacity would be significantly reduced because fewer resources are available. As humans, we have intentionally altered our environment to reduce environmental resistance to increase the Earth's carrying capacity for us. Technologies, such as improved crop varieties and sanitation systems, have allowed us to overcome many limiting factors. The consequence of lowering our own environmental resistance is that we have reduced the carrying capacity of countless other organisms. Ultimately, this calls into question our own long-term survival, since we are inevitably linked to the health of the planet and its species. Limiting factors are factors related to a species' environment that influence their population size. However, there are attributes of the organism itself that influence population size. The best example of this would be biotic potential, or the potential to produce offspring. Organisms are often classified based on their reproductive strategy or biotic potential and are either called R-selected species or K-selected species. Characteristics of K-selected species are long gestational periods, few offspring, high investment in offspring, slow sexual maturity, population stabilization at or near carrying capacity, and poor colonization success but high competition success. Bears, whales, and deer are examples of K-selected species. R-selected species, by contrast, are typically much smaller than K-selected species. They have high biotic potential, meaning they reproduce a lot of young very quickly. They reach sexual maturity quickly, have short lives, usually have less parental investment in their young, have populations that usually fluctuate well below carrying capacity, and they are usually good colonizers but poor competitors. Fish, frogs, and insects are good examples of R-selected species. Here's a quick concept check for you. Which of the following describes a population growing by a fixed percent? A. Logistic, B. Exponential, C. Logical, D. Linear, or E. Rationed? The answer is exponential. Remember that this is a J-shaped curve and occurs when a population grows without constraints by a fixed percent. Here's another concept check. Which type of distribution would most likely be seen in a desert oasis? A. Random, B. Uniform, C. Clumped, D. Random and clumped, or E. Uniform and clumped? The answer is clumped, because the organisms would be clumped around the water and resources in the oasis. This concludes this mini lecture on population ecology. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline. Thanks and gig 'em!